Now, the Brixton Cemetery in Johannesburg has become a home for many homeless people who have built makeshift houses on top of tombstones. While the housing crisis has been one of South Africa's perennial problems, the COVID-19 pandemic has worsened the situation. We're now joined by City Park spokesperson Jenny Moodley to discuss the challenges faced by homeless people in Johannesburg. Jenny, very good morning. Great speaking to you. Now, don't know about you, but certainly for us and our viewers, it's a little bizarre and really shocking to see that people are resorting to cemeteries to build their homes, if you will.
Absolutely, and good morning to all. Yes, thank you for helping highlight the plight of displaced persons and the challenges faced by cities in dealing with this growing concern. The City of Joburg has put in place a multi-entity response working closely with social services, social housing, the drug rehabilitation clinics, and to some extent, home affairs. It has found that the unwillingness for many displaced persons to register with the shelter and comply with the daily structure requirements of a shelter is part of the problem. To a large extent, poverty underlined by mental wellness, drug dependencies, and having no documents to support being legally in the country has resulted in people seeking shelter in open spaces such as our parks, cemeteries, and of course what you saw at Brixton Cemetery.
So is Brixton the only cemetery that has been taken over by homeless people, or is this prevalent in other cemeteries?
Yes, unfortunately it's prevalent in other cemeteries, particularly our dormant cemeteries. Brixton, Brixton Cemetery, pockets of cemeteries on the outskirts of the city. We do have sporadic reports of this issue, but Brixton and Brixton are where you're seeing large numbers of people gathering, utilizing the cemetery after hours. And, one of my colleagues said, and you could see from the interviews, people felt safe in these dormant cemeteries and so on. And one of my colleagues made a reference. He said, cemeteries should not just be receptacles for the dead, but how do we involve the living? And perhaps it's time for some of those hard conversations, some unconventional thinking. We've seen case studies across the globe when it comes to displaced persons. It's not something unique to South Africa or Johannesburg. We're finding that even in your very developed cities like Vancouver, like New York and so on, there are people with drug dependencies that don't want the structure offered to them when it comes to shelter and social housing. And perhaps we should look at cemeteries like your Brixton and Brixton, where there are, except for city parks, that goes in and cleans these spaces. There's really a family member. As you know, the cemetery was opened in the late 1900s. So unfortunately, family members do not visit the cemetery. We do have the odd heritage society that's very involved on special occasions, and except for the crematorium at Brixton Cemetery, the space is largely dormant. And so perhaps we should start looking at very unconventional ways, start documenting the rich heritage found in that, put it on an online feature, and decide how do we repurpose cemeteries like Brixton and Brixton to accommodate displaced persons, to look at transitional housing, and to put in place a very humane way of dealing with this issue. A lot of people are saying, we want to have a bath. We want to store our recycling material where nobody else takes all that we've collected for the day. We want to have some sort of help desk where we can have some level of screening. We know issues like TB and other health concerns are very prevalent. So how do we as city decision makers come together with various levels of government and various entities to basically get a grasp of the growing situation that cities are faced with?
Well, I'm glad your plan is not to kick them out, because obviously they appear to be very desperate. I mean, in African culture, it's taboo to walk into a cemetery, never mind to live there or put up shelter in the middle of the night. Do you have a contingency plan of dealing with these individuals, Jenny?
Well, largely what's happened is the city has got a displaced housing desk, and they are documenting persons who are willingly coming forward and wanting to be documented. and then the whole screening process and so on happens. As you know, during the height of COVID in July last year, there was a whole skills development program also factored into the whole relocation of displaced persons along some of the parks and along the streets in the city. Sadly, again, there was no willingness from these participants to stay committed to the program, so quite often it comes apart. But going back in terms of the displaced persons at Brixton, City Parks, as you know, conducts cleanups on a regular basis. Where there are new structures and so on, we have an obligation to make sure that that's removed and cleaned. We need to retain the sanctity of our cemeteries, and as much as to some extent we're losing the battle when it comes to Brixton and Braamfontein, we do know there's some sort of coordination happening amongst the displaced persons living there. There's no, in terms of behaviors, we're finding that, yes, there's some level of criminal activity. We know that there's opportunistic crime taking place to some extent. And again, it's all relative to people not wanting structure so that they could conduct these unsavory activities after hours. So we go in there, clean up, remove a lot of, as you could see in our last cleanup, we had 4 trucks present on the 28th of July, cleaning up a lot of the refuse. People, unfortunately, at that level and due to mental wellness, they're on. So there's a huge number of issues, and as much as it sounds very overwhelming for entities like Joburg City Parks and Zoo, there is a concerted effort by the city to deal with this issue.
Jenny, before we let you go, COVID has obviously wreaked havoc on all and sundry, 72,000 deaths since last year. I'd like to presume that this has impacted cemetery space in Gauteng.
Yes, absolutely. As much as Joburg City Parks has got 34 cemeteries, around 30 have reached full capacity for primary burials, unless, of course, an individual has approached the cemetery to allocate a space for a spouse and so on. But in 30 of our cemeteries, we are finding that there's levels of opportunistic crime and other concerns. The 4 very active cemeteries, the Olifants Vlei Cemetery, West Park, of course, Avalon to some extent, and then Diepsloot in the far north, and Allendale, the Midrand Cemetery. These are sort of 4, I say Avalon as much as Avalon's reached full capacity for primary burials, but still very active when it comes to reopenings. So yes, we're dealing with, on a weekly basis, we've got between 120 to 180 burials happening. That excludes cemeteries. For example, our Lenasia Cemetery in the month of June, we went to 297 cremations. So these are growing numbers. Joburg has got adequate burial space in the event of any catastrophe. We've got over 1,016,000 spaces available. Those spaces need to be prepared for graves and so on. So we do have delays. We do have some levels of backlog when it comes to administratively dealing with burials. There's a very, very thorough process to follow, and we are appealing to funeral homes, to families, to be patient with us. As you know, our staff are at the forefront. We too have had reports of deaths and infections and people isolating, so it's impacted on timely service delivery. So a huge appeal to the residents in the city of Joburg for patience and to please comply with all regulations. We urge you to ensure that 50 people are only present during a burial, to make sure that you also are complying with social distancing, to make sure that you carry your sanitizers. The big concern we have at funerals is when there are a huge number of people and then you have remnants of water bottles, flowers, tissues, and litter. And we're saying, the integrity of our cemeteries need to be retained. So we're appealing for you, leave the cemetery like you found it.
Final question, have you had to employ more individuals to work for you amidst all that is sadly going on?
Absolutely. We've had to look to the expanded public works program. We brought in more ushers to come in. We also have a huge dependency on entities like the Joburg Metro Police Department regarding compliance and congestion and traffic issues. We've had to look at how our staff are allocated and the days in lieu of working, how they're structured. So it has had taken its toll in terms of dealing with, the human issue. People are mourning and so on. So for us, it's a humanity issue. We know that, there's a lot of people who've never had a death in the family for a number of years, and they are expected to know these processes. So we're saying turn to your funeral homes, your funeral directors, let them facilitate this for you. And again, please comply for your own safety. We've had reports of funerals being super spreaders. We're saying we calling on every family member to ensure that they get vaccinated and to make sure that they comply with all these regulations in place.
Jenny Moodley, General Manager at Joburg Parks and Zoo, thank you for your time this morning.